Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Victory Podcast. I'm your host, Monique Watson, and I want to thank you for joining me on our second episode. So, in this episode of the Victory Podcast, I sat down with my pastor from childhood and adulthood and all of those great things, Robert Charles Blakes Jr., and we sat and talked about those great things, Robert Charles Blakes Jr., and we sat and talked about, managing and coping with disasters. He talks a bit about losing his father as being one of the most challenging things he's had to do in his life. He also talks about being a pastor during her. Hope you enjoy it. This is your host, Monique Watson, and I'm here with my guest for the evening, Bishop. This is your host, Monique Watson, and I'm here with my guest for the evening, Bishop Robert Charles Blakes Jr., which is always funny to me to actually have to say your full name. So welcome. I have to say your full name. So welcome to the podcast, Pastor.
Well, thank you for having me. I am so honored. Usually, young people do not want to hear anything old people have to say. So I'm honored that all millennials are not have not turned.
Not at all. So maybe to get started, maybe you can give the listeners a little background about yourself, kind of who you are, and a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am. The short of my name is R.C. Blakes. I go by my first two initials. And I am a pastor, 55 years old presently, and born and raised in the city of New Orleans, born into a pastor's home, pastor's family. And I'm second generation pastor, along with my brother. We along with my brother. We pastor the same church that we were raised in, the church that our father pastored. And that church has multiple locations between Louisiana and Texas. I am the husband of Lisa Blakes, a wonderful son. I'm an author. I write books. I have a women's empowerment ministry and movement called Queenology that speaks to the empowerment of women from a fatherly perspective. Um, and I'm just and I'm presently on this interview, this call with you, and I'm excited about it.
But yeah, so I wanted to talk about a couple topics. So you mentioned in your description of yourself, and just a full disclosure for those listening, I've known Pastor RC for like most of my life. He married me and my husband. I grew up in the church in New Orleans, so known the whole Blanks family. Hung out with all of the kids as they've grown up. The younger crew. And so super close, and couldn't think of anyone better who I admire, is like a kind of a second father in a way, to kind of interview, and very insightful. As he mentioned, a women's empowerment type of ministry is one of the many segments to the ministry. And so I thought it would be good to kind of get some insights of your family members. So in your case, it's pastoring, so it might be a little bit different than those who might work in another family business or work with their family members. But maybe you can talk about some of those challenges that you run into pastoring, especially now pastoring with your brother, being co-leads of a multi-set, working with your family. How it goes.
Um, it is a blessing and a challenge to actually work with your family, be it in ministry or in business. It's a challenge because respect the line between what is personal, what is professional, or what is business. And quite often, when people work with their family, um, many times they are wearing their personal family hat when their personal family hat when they should be wearing their professional hat. And so, in terms of working with my family, that has been a challenge. Just figuring out, um, for instance, who makes the call, who makes the call, who's, whatever the challenge is that is before us, we have to figure out who's stronger in this particular respect and who should lead, knowing when to fall back and knowing when it's your time to actually take the helm, knowing when it's your time to actually take the helm or take the steering wheel. Um, those things can be a challenge. And then being able to separate maybe disagreements or differences in terms of ministry or professional from our not carrying personal disagreements over into a professional or ministry setting or business setting. Um, if you're working with someone other than your family, I mean, that's your coworker, period. And once you're done with whatever that job is or that assignment is, you perform whatever the function is in terms of ministry or business. You don't leave there and go home to your family. It's all one and the same. So I think that's the greatest challenge. But I would say that it's a um, greater blessing than it is a challenge. The motivation of people, you never have to second guess if they really have your back. Um, it's a tightrope, but it's worth the effort when all parties involved are really giving their to it, giving everything. And that is the case with my family. Everybody really gives it their all, and everybody has the right heart. And so we do it well. We do it without a lot of friction. That's not always the case with families that work together in ministry. But in our case, it is. It is. But in our case, it is. It is. It's without a lot of friction, and it's because we really go overboard in terms of respecting those lines and having that mutual respect for one another and understanding our roles and understanding in terms of respecting those lines and having that mutual respect for one another and understanding our roles and understanding our strengths and our weaknesses. There are situations that I simply get out of the way because there are situations that my brother is better suited to match strengths and our weaknesses. There are situations that I simply get out of the way because there are situations that my brother is better suited to manage, and there are situations that he does the same for me. So it's not about who's the boss. A lot of families get caught up in that. Who's the boss? And egos clash. Things can really be accomplished. And I think my family is a testament to that.
I would say I definitely definitely agree. Um, for sure, seeing from a not intimately involved into the inner workings, but like I say, you know, probably issues that arise, whether that's directly related to the specific leading of how they do everyday activities related to the ministry, but you can definitely notice when there's a cohesion and when there's not, and when there's something, whether you know the actual ins and outs of the background story
Yeah,
of what's actually going place of worship, right? It's where the spirit
absolutely.
is either there or it isn't, or you're trying to make him appear
That's
which that ain't which doesn't happen. This is no
trying to
conjuring or
fabricate,
something like that. So
trying to fabricate a move of God. But
yeah,
like you said, it's either there, it's not.
conjuring or
Fabricate,
something like that. So
trying to fabricate a move of God. But
yeah,
like you said, it's either there, it's not. And I thank God in our case, it is. It's authentic. It's natural. And it's real. It's it's natural, and it's real.
For sure, for sure. So, in that same vein of working with family and family, so as you said, you're a second generation pastor. Your spiritual father for many. So, how was it? I know leading up to as he was aging and things that you could tell you all were being groomed to eventually kind of take over in that space and lead the church. And then, how was that as far as when that actual transition when it went on to heaven and kind of dealing with that as both a child of this is your actual father and then do the second side of that coin being this is your spiritual father, so that dual loss of both of this is your actual father and then do the second side of that coin being this is your spiritual father, so that dual loss of both your natural father and your spiritual father, and then having to step up uh, to then lead. Can you kind of having to step up uh, to then lead? Can you kind of talk about some of that, both the loss of a parent in itself and then the unique challenge that you have around being a pastor at the same time?
Well, I think I was about 40. I think I was about 40, 48, 40, going on 49 when he passed. And, though some would say, well, man, you had your dad a long time. I did. But it doesn't matter how old you are or how old they talk with younger people who've lost parents in their 20s or their 30s. And our stories are the same. The pain, the sense of it's a sense of trepidation and fear actually, because you don't realize it, but subconsciously, parent that's really been there and done his or her job in your life. Um, when you've had that kind of parent subconsciously, you view them as your foundation, and they really are. Though they groom you, they develop you, they raise you to be an independent individual, even beyond them. Um, just the idea of existing without them is just unbelievable. And when you're suddenly faced with the idea that, life as a child, and even as an adult child, is suddenly gone, um, that's unthinkable. You don't have a plan for that. You don't know how to adjust. You don't know how to resume life. Just thinking about not another conversation, no more counseling sessions. Here's the one person in the world that if I got into some kind of challenge, this was my bailout. He was my bailout. He was my bailout. Well, I don't have that anymore. Thinking about it, as a natural child, and then you compound that issue with being in ministry with him, and he being your pastor, and he being the head of the ministry, and he being this larger than life figure, this charismatic, very, highly spiritual figure. And now all of a sudden he's gone, and the people say, okay, now it's your turn. And you're trying to figure out now how than his, and my approach is different than his. And people, I have his name, by the way. I'm Robert Blake's junior. He was senior. So people are going to expect Robert Blake's, the old version, not necessarily the new version. So you battle in your mind with that. Now, how do I do ministry now? Do I change? Do I remain authentic to, do I remain authentic, to who I really am? because you don't want to step up to the plate and then have the ministry that he spent 50 years building unravel because people say, oh well, the brand has changed, if you were putting it in business terms, or it's not the same. He's not his daddy, or they're not their father. So I didn't really have a lot of time to effectively grieve as a son for having to step into the larger than life shoes of being his successor.
Right.
And and that was something that kind of it was, having to step into his shoes in some way was a positive thing, because it allowed me to work through my grief. I had a lot to keep me preoccupied in terms of how do I stabilize this ministry, step into those shoes immediately. He died on a Thursday morning about 1 o'clock, and 7 o'clock that evening, I was in his church doing service, because I
Wow.
realized that I had to press into it, because if I didn't, it could have really stalled me for longer than would have been healthy for the ministry. So I jumped in immediately.
Wow.
Um, what it did not do was, it did not allow me, like normal people do. It did not allow me to grieve on schedule. So I had to grieve in spurts. And so it took me years to be able to get to, the point where I had grieved effectively enough to be able to have a conversation like this. He's been gone now, I think, going on 7 years or something like that. And, for the first 4 years of that, I could not have had a conversation like this without becoming emotional, because though the years had passed, the responsibility did not allow me the time to really completely grieve, um, on schedule, is the way I put it. So I had to grieve when life allowed me.
Mhm.
And within the last, 3 years or so, I came to that place where I've really processed that. Um, but it's a bigger. You think about the loss of a parent. It's such a challenge that I actually grieve for my children, thinking about the day will come when they will have to put me to rest, or put their mother to rest. Um, it's bigger than religious cliches. And I would say to anyone, when a person is dealing with the transition of a loved one, a parent, a sibling, a spouse, a child, the last thing you should do is to go into their, space with a lot of religious cliches. Sometimes the
Right.
best thing you can do is just say, I'm here and I'm praying and I love you, and leave it at that. But yeah, it was certainly the greatest test of my life, I promise you. And it still proves to be the greatest test of my life. It proves to be the greatest test of my life. It grew me in ways, and it strengthened me. There's the saying that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well,
Mhm.
when you go through something like that, you come out on the other side of it with a greater tenacity. It's like if I made it through this, what else can life throw at me that I cannot handle?
Right.
So, that's a positive that I take from it. That's a positive that I take from it. Did I touch on everything you wanted me to touch on with that?
No, I think absolutely, yeah. Did you at any time, now you mentioned, like being taken on the full mantle and kind of being enveloped into now leading the ministry. Um, did at any point did you ever like seek any like counseling or any kind of whether that's spiritual counseling or like psychological counseling in struggling with that um loss, or not? I mean, either
I
way,
did.
there's no right answer or wrong answer, but just
I did
curious for the
not.
listeners.
I did not. I did not. I did not seek. Um, did not. I did not seek um, any kind of counseling. And that was, to be honest with you, in retrospect, that was a massive mistake and a very, very risky behavior. Um, behavior, because I was really in a broken state, and I was holding it together just by the skin of my teeth, and a lot was riding on me. And when I look back over it now, it was nobody but God that really kept me together and carried me through that. Because had I fallen apart, um, who knows what would have been the outcome. So when I look back on it in retrospect, there's no way in the world that I would have tried to process all of that without, the assistance, being African American and coming out of the deep South, a city like New Orleans. We're kind of directly or mostly indirectly trained against seeking any kind of counsel. There's this thing: don't share your business, your personal business, with people, and all of that kind of thing. And to try to process things that are above your pay grade on your own.
Hmm.
It was nobody but God that kept me together, because I should have, honestly, I should have broken 1,000 times. And if I had to do it over again, or the week of my father's death, I would have been in somebody's office. One of the things that I think definitely prevented me was never that I was against counseling or therapy, anything like that. But one of the things that prevented me is that, being from a city like New Orleans, as you know, that's a very small place. And Orleans, as you know, that's a very small place, and everybody knows everybody. And so it's kind of hard to, when you come from a family that is as well known, it's kind of hard to feel like your innermost secrets are really safe with anybody, because everybody's kind of connected. It's most secrets are really safe with anybody because everybody's kind of connected. It's not like a Chicago or a New York City or Los Angeles, where you can go on the other side of town and you may be an international figure. Nobody knows you on the other side of town. It's a small little city, and so, or Los Angeles, where you can go on the other side of town and you may be an international figure. Nobody knows you on the other side of town. It's a small little city, and so I think that worked against my making the right decision to actually seek counseling. Um, I did not seek any. Um, I did not seek any spiritual counseling because, again, this was my pastor. I did not have anybody. I had no other prominent older leaders in my life that I revered or esteemed to that level for those reasons.
It makes sense. And not that therapy is necessary for everybody or not necessary for people, but it definitely is something to see that you can some people are capable and can do it without it, and then others need that help and need those assistance. And that's, I think, why God puts people like psychiatrists, psychologists, what have you, family therapists, all the different kinds of resources out there for those who need it, for sure. So yeah.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree.
I guess one of the last big buckets we can talk about is being from New Orleans. It's a big, small town, one of the, in my opinion, greatest cities in the world. Um, and one of the first things, and I know you get this as you travel around the country and the world, the first thing, how were you affected about Hurricane Katrina? Where were you when that happened? Kind of like if you ask somebody from New York, about where were they on 9/11, so as long as they're like over, weren't born in 2004 or something like that. There's adults now running around not born, not experiencing 9/11, because many people in the world and listening to this podcast have never or will never really experience a large natural disaster or major disaster, like physical disaster in their life. So maybe you can kind of talk about your what I call, your evacuation story. Everyone's got their Katrina, how they then rebuild, and kind of some of that journey to go from, for those on the podcast who aren't listening to the podcast who aren't from New Orleans, previous to Hurricane Katrina, at least I can speak to my perspective of hurricane evacuation was a little bit more of a like evacuation was a little bit more of a like evacuation vacation. It like
Yeah,
never really hit
exactly.
directly in New Orleans. It did like way back in like Hurricane Betsy was what the previous to that, the most devastating kind of recent history hurricane to the New Orleans area. Devastating kind of recent history hurricane to the New Orleans area. People were kind of like, well, I survived Betsy. I'm not going to evacuate it. It's not a big deal. We'll get some rain, maybe a little bit of flooding, whatever, whatever. And even to the fact of certain parts of the city of New Orleans, just given that New Orleans is in a bowl, can to the city of New Orleans, just given that New Orleans is in a bowl, can flood on a rain event just a Tuesday. So maybe you can talk about your whole Katrina story a little bit.
Well, when Katrina was approaching the city of New Orleans, I actually was planning to stay in the city. It was my father then who called me and told me that, well, he kind of demanded that I would leave, because I had,
Gentle soul. I'm
oh,
sure he
no,
gently, but very much was like,
no,
maybe you should consider
no,
about this.
no. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a very strong command from my pastor, my boss, my father. He said, no uncertainty. I said, okay, I will. But just, such a diehard, I actually went to church that Sunday morning. And normally we would have two services on a Sunday morning. And that particular Sunday morning, we had five people. And
Wow.
so since we started late leaving, for evacuation purposes, everybody was going to Houston. Lisa and I and the kids, we got in three cars and we drove towards Atlanta. Finally making it to Atlanta after God knows how many hours. And the storm, seemed to have passed. And like you said, for most of us, it's always like an evacuation that's more like a vacation. And watching the news, and then I see that the levees broke or whatever were breached, and the water just kind of invaded the city, and I watched neighborhoods and areas that I was so familiar with completely flooded out, and I'm looking at bodies floating in the city that I grew up in, the city that I called home. So I was in really a state of shock. I could not leave the television. I was trying our church. That at that time, that was the only church that I pastored. I was a one location pastor, which was a wonderful life for me. Um, that area was completely inundated, and they really had talks of it never, East New Orleans never coming back again. Talks of making it, by the time it was all said and done, um, we realized that we could not get back into the city of New Orleans. So my family was in Houston, so we made our way to Houston, Texas. And the news just got worse and worse and worse. And so we had a lot of our members that were in Houston. And so we just started meeting as we waited to be able to get back into the city of New Orleans. We lived in a hotel. I forget exactly what little brand hotel it was, but we lived in a hotel for 2 months. And we worshiped at the University of Houston. Me and some of the members from New Home Family Worship Center and others from other churches, but from New Orleans. And that church ended up literally planting that church in the city of Houston, Texas. And then finally, when we could get back into the city of New Orleans, one of our locations, one of three of our locations, had gotten 16 feet of water.
Wow.
Our church, the church that roofs were torn off of the two buildings, and water came in through through the ceiling.
Mhm.
Um, and it was just wow. It was at that time, it was prior to my father's passing. It was the worst. It was building that church, building that congregation in East New Orleans, and 95% of it was the congregation was dispersed across the country or to other parts of the area. And yeah, and it took us years, a few years actually, to get back to repairing the roof, to getting back into our East New Orleans facility. So in the meantime, we just we worked from our main we worked from our main location, which was the location my father was the pastor, the immediate pastor of. We had multiple services in there, and then eventually we got East New Orleans back up, and I was flying back and forth between New Orleans and Houston on Southwest every Sunday morning, trying to do Bible studies, and it was so extremely taxing. Uh, had the same ministry had the same bills, but a fraction of the income because the people weren't there anymore. And so when I go across the country and people say, well, why is it taking so long to recover from Katrina, or you all should be over that now. You can't really speak to that unless you've had your entire life actually wiped out overnight, and have to start over. I think when Katrina hit, I was 40 years old. And so it meant to start over again. You're talking about a midlife crisis. I'm having to start over again. And so processing all of that and having to, find the faith, finding something positive, bills and expenses and all of this stuff piling up, trying to keep my family together, kids at the time. We decided to educate them in Houston because New Orleans, we didn't know what was going on. And so, beginning at that point, I started living a life where I was separate from my family. I started traveling back and forth to New Orleans, and between New Orleans and Houston, my family was in Houston, and I'm traveling back and forth. It changed everything about my life. Um, it's just been within recent years that I've actually processed that, and I've been able to. Katrina, I would you know go to sleep and say, well, tomorrow I'll wake up and it'll be normal. I'll feel normal. My ministry will feel normal. My life will feel normal. And I kept reaching for that. And the Bible says,
Right.
hope deferred makes the heart sick. You keep. One day I had to just completely grieve. I had to completely grieve Katrina, and I had to accept the fact that my life now had uh, a new normal.
Right.
And when I accepted that and articulated that, that it was like a weight lifted off of me. And then I kind of rolled my sleeves up and I got busy with embracing the new normal that God has chosen to bestow upon me and life is delivered to me. And so now we're in a place where it does not feel the same. It's very different. but we're postured to do greater things than ever. You know, and there are a lot of things that came out of the disruption of Katrina that I believe has set that I believe has set my life and set our ministry on a path to do greater things than we probably ever would have done had we stayed in that comfort zone that we called normal prior to Katrina.
Right.
So, you know, you have to find. So, you know, you have to find. I think it's Ralph Waldo Emerson who said, "The marks of a mentally healthy person is one that is able to find the positive in anything." And so now
Right.
I'm in the business of just, finding and focusing on the positives, on the positives. And Katrina has certainly brought a lot of positives. It's brought a lot of great people into my life, new people, but great people. It's brought a lot of old people out of my life, which, has been a challenge at times, but, um, and it's expanded me. It's expanded my, because quite honestly, the first real suffering I did was after Katrina. Up until that point, I did not really know what suffering was.
Right.
Um, and I think everybody at some point in life, you have to feel the sting of suffering. We don't realize that we're coddled and we're pampered until we're not. And that's what Katrina did for me. It was a wake up call that really grew me up, and it developed some things in me that I probably never would have had outside of that experience.
For sure. For sure. For sure. For sure.
I
Thank
hope
you
I'm
for
not rambling. Hope I'm not rambling.
No, no, absolutely not. I think it's Katrina was one of the most impactful things for anyone who's from New Orleans, grew up in New Orleans, has any real love. Quick elevator version of Katrina. For me, it was my first week of classes in school in college. So it's my first week of courses. So I was kind of removed from it. I got a call from my parents saying that they were going to evacuate. They didn't do like y'all and take a couple of the cars like they probably should have evacuated, which was surprising because they were ones that of the breed of folks that said, "Oh, we survived Hurricane Betsy, and so we don't evacuate in general." And so they also evacuated my great grandmother who was alive at the time as well. So they all evacuated and went to my aunt's house who was living in Houston at the time. All evacuated and went to my aunt's house who was living in Houston at the time, and her husband is from New Orleans as well. So their family evacuated there. So, and then as you mentioned, the levee bricks and everything like that. So they had 20 plus people living in a,
Woo,
how 20 plus people living in a,
woo.
how they have a no, to be fair, my aunt is a doctor and she has a very large size house, but it's never intended for 20 some odd adults and children to live in, right? So my parents quote unquote bed to live in, right? So my parents quote unquote bed, and I use air quotes, which translates well on a podcast, bed was in the floor of the master closet in their house. Like they had the
Wow.
older people, yeah, they had a pallet like on the floor in the master closet, because they let the that were in there. I think it was just as far as young kids was just my cousin Christian and Gabrielle. I think Gabrielle was born. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So they were in a bed. They shared a bed together, and then the other like elder parents, like grandparent age folks, got the actual beds in bedroom. Everyone else was kind of getting where you fit in for a while. And then my parents eventually moved out of there and rented a house not far away in Houston for a while. And then they did return to New Orleans. At the time, they lived in graduate housing for a while, for a couple months. So yeah, graduate housing because my mom was getting her PhD at the time. So we're in graduate housing, and then we moved. Then they moved from there to a family friend in a different part of the city that didn't get any flooding. After my grandparents moved out of there, they kind of moved, and we kind of been shadowing, kind of back to New Orleans. Moved into that like a house in New Orleans, and then finally rebuilt completely to move back into our family home. So that was a thing. And to really, I think the best perspective, and my Uncle Rustin, when he was interviewed for something for, I think it was what's the guy from the Saints with ALS? Um, what's the guy from the Saints with ALS? Um,
I know who you're
Gleason.
talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, the Gleason, Steve Gleason Foundation. They did like a interview 10 years after Katrina with my Uncle Rustin, who owned a pharmacy in the lower ninth ward, and they lost to their flooding, and like a number of people lost their businesses and things like that. And he equated as far as the impact, and this goes to your point about people asking like, how can y'all not be over it already because it's so long ago. And then he equated it to, if your house caught on fire, you could go to your neighbors, your grandparents, or something like that, get help, and everyone else is fire.
That's right. Everybody.
Everybody. So every kind of network, like where you'd be like, oh, I could just go and get help from here, and everyone caught on fire at all the same time. So that's why it's kind of a hard bit to rebuild and really kind of change for folks. So I think definitely you really captured. So I think definitely you really captured the challenges there, especially it's a unique perspective that you have with being a pastor is a different vibe as a calling and profession. As far as when something like that happens, not only are you thinking about your nuclear family and how like that happens, not only are you thinking about your nuclear family and how to rebuild and what you're going to do, you have to think about how can I return my quote unquote business and my church and the needs of my people at the same time. So it's definitely a unique perspective for sure.
Yes, ma'am.
So it's definitely a unique perspective for sure.
Yes, ma'am. It was the greatest challenge of my life. And so many people suffered in ways that they can't even articulate. We have members, had members, should I say, in their homes because of the waters.
Mm,
Um, so many stories, so many stories, and it's it'll be with you for the rest of your life. To be quite honest with you,
right.
yeah, I'll be talking about Katrina.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, those are the main kind of buckets. So just to kind of put a buttonhole, a couple of things. Last thing, like a quick note. So you've been through what I would say a lot of amazing, challenging circumstances throughout your life, especially sounds like almost, a lot of the ones you referenced with Katrina and loss of your father is like kind of in that over 40 kind of,
Yeah,
usually folks are hitting a certain stride, you're in your 40s, you get to, you know, things are just kind of rolling with it, or I imagine that's kind of how I envision people, once you kind of hit a certain point.
yeah.
And so maybe one kind of take home message for folks who may be going through their various own trials, whether it's trials in their career, trials on a personal level. What are some of your, a couple of maybe one or two points, maybe in addition to the stuff you've already shared, and maybe even one or two scriptures that are like a good go to that you kind of meditate on or think about when you're going through some, or that you did use to think about when.
Well, I would say to a person that is facing one of these, a season like this, where the unexpected, kind of overwhelms your life, where you feel in things are reality. And all of us at some point in time in life, we will experience that. For me, I didn't know that I would be starting my life and basically my ministry over again at 40 years old. I didn't know. I didn't know. At 48, almost 49, I still wasn't prepared for the death of my father. These are the two most traumatizing events in my life. And there are a few things I learned along the way through both of those experiences. Through both of those experiences. The first thing I learned is that if God allows you to come into something by his sovereignty, if he allows something to touch your life, he has also empowered you to manage it, to master it, and to come through it, and to master it, and to come through it, and to come over it if you trust him. The second thing I learned is that, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, some kind of way we have to give voice to the pressure that we feel on the inside when we're, you know, my saving grace was that I'm a very transparent person. So I would speak my feelings, even though I did not go to therapy in conversation, even in terms of ministry. I would actually speak how I felt, sure. And then having just the tenacity, just having that confidence in God that even though I don't understand exactly what's going on, I don't know what you're doing, I'm not really pleased with you right now. And some days I felt like that about God. I know that you have a plan. And I know that I'm not really pleased with you right now. And some days I felt like that about God. I know that you have a plan. And I know that my life does not end like this. My life does not end on a down note. That somehow, some kind of way, you're going to pull me through this. My life does not end on a down note. That somehow, some kind of way, you're going to pull me through this. And though it may feel like it's the end of the world now, there's something inside of this experience that is building me for a greater future. And the script 1, verse 2, it says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith," verse 3, "worketh patience. But let patience have a perfect work, that you your life into your spiritual, your emotional stature." When you're in one of those seasons, God is building you. He's adding substance to your life. Because at the end of the day, our lives are not our own. Our lives are God's call. And our lives, if we're going to live, sometimes you have to feel it before God will empower you to heal it. So some of the things that you're going through today are really for other people tomorrow.
Mm,
That's some of what I've taken from my experiences.
that's awesome. That's really good. There was one scripture I'll add to, and then we'll get into the how folks can find you on social media and learn more about New Home and your ministry, and especially some of the women's empowerment stuff, which we could do a whole nother podcast interview on some of that. But one verse that actually this Sunday my pastor was talking about, um, was in the past. Let me say this: the pastor here that I have locally, you're still always my pastor. It's like, let me backtrack that. Uh, but the pastor that's here in San Jose that go to, he had a from Romans chapter 5, verses 3 through 5. And I think this is the New King James Version. I don't know. But it says, "And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope. Now, hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who has given to us." And it's
Mm,
one of those things. Yeah, it was one I had, and I was like, Romans is pretty and stuff like that. But that was one I hadn't really, I missed or forgot about or something. I don't know, but it really spoke to me. But it's just the same idea of there's there's confidence in knowing as a child of God that there is more to your story.
yeah,
There's
yeah,
never in any story in the Bible ever been that was they went through a thing and boom, the end.
absolutely.
From whether you're talking about Jesus himself of dying on the cross, it wasn't like he died and the end, and in the book, call it done. from, David, just countless stories in the Bible of something happened, and it was Job is the ultimate of that whole thing of, losing his family, Job, to that point, and still at the end is something greater than what he could have foreseen going through it. And having that in your mind when you're going through something, and it's easier to say when you've made it on the other side. And I know a lot of people, and for those listening, if you're going through something right now, through this, and this is how I feel, and this is why I feel this way because of X, Y, and Z, and maybe I didn't have a good parent, or maybe I didn't have these other things that some people are blessed and afforded to, but understand that is never the end of your story. And it's never the end, because God never to harm you, give you hope in a future, and give you in your expected end, right? So it's that idea of that there is more. There is never a period to the story. There's always a comma or semicolon, something that continues it.
Yes. Yes, you are correct, ma'am. You are preaching here. You are correct, ma'am. You are preaching here today.
Yeah. And we're standing all over the chapel. We're standing. We'll do the benediction in a minute. No, I'm kidding. All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your time this evening. I know it's later, especially. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your time this evening. I know it's later, especially you're on the East Coast right now visiting. You're in Philadelphia, is it?
I'm in Philadelphia. I was in Connecticut 4 days ago.
Oh, my.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so I'll be quick. We'll just kind of wrap up with what are some ways. Yeah, so I'll be quick. We'll just kind of wrap up with what are some ways that folks who are maybe interested in learning more about R.C. Blake's or about New Home or what have you, what are some ways on the different maybe social media platforms or websites that you can direct some folks to?
They can find me on Facebook. Your mother's the one that actually created my first Facebook page. She told me I needed to have it, actually. They can find me on Facebook at R.C. Blake's. And, of course, on YouTube at R.C. Blake's Jr. Actually, they can kind of go through and see a lot of my my teachings on queenology, the women's empowerment stuff, the father-daughter talk. Of course, they can go to my website at rcblakes.com, or they can go to the ministry's website at comehome2newhome.org. Instagram is RC Blakes. Just look for RC Blakes. I'm everywhere. And I'd love to connect with you.
Awesome. And I'm going to link all of Pastor Blake's social media, the Pastor Blake's social media, the website, and all the YouTube channel as well to the notes. But awesome. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on this podcast, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, my dear. I love you.
Love you too, Pastor. Well, I'd like to thank my guest, R.C. Blake's Jr., for joining me. And if you're looking for more information on how to reach out to Pastor Blake's, or more information about his different ministries that he mentioned around women's empowerment and queenology and just good information from him, I'll be linking on the Victory Podcast website, which is thevictorypodcast.com. Links to his YouTube, Facebook, and other different social media platforms that you can reach out to him on. You can also find on Twitter, we're on Instagram and Facebook as The Victory Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and The Victory Podcast on Facebook. So you can find all those and more. Hopefully you found this episode helpful to you, and feel free to reach out with your comments, questions on thevictorypodcast.com, and hit us on that contact form. Stay tuned for more content coming in the future. And as I sign off on every episode, every problem has a solution. It's whether you're willing to do the work to find it. Problem has a solution. It's whether you're willing to do the work to find it. Let's do the work so we can be victorious.